So yesterday we were working on period 3, and we left off with our first presidential administration, that of George Washington. You know, Washington's administration has a number of challenges facing it. The French Revolution had broken out in 1789. The United States, young United States, because of its relationship with France as an ally during the American Revolution, was divided over whether it should support the revolutionaries in France, who increasingly grew more and more radical throughout the 1790s, or whether it should have closer ties with Great Britain, its mother country, right? Now remember, the last thing that I talked about yesterday was Washington forming his first cabinet with Henry Knox as Secretary of War. We will not call it the Secretary of Defense until after the Second World War. The Postmaster General, who was also the Attorney General, right? And that being Edmund Randolph. And then, of course, the two stars of Jefferson's cabinet. Of Washington's cabinet. Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. We also have a vice president, right? He's going to be our second president of the United States, serving under Washington, who presides over the U.S. Senate. And that, of course, is founding father John Adams, okay? So Washington's administration has to deal with the crisis of the French Revolution. Washington's administration had to deal with the debts coming out of the Revolutionary War experience. Washington's administration had to set precedent for what the federal government would look like and how it would run. Washington's administration has to deal with Native American conflicts on the frontier. Washington's administration gives us the first census of 1790, the first population count. And Washington's administration will also broker for us the first issues in foreign policy. It will deal with such issues as the Whiskey Rebellion. It will deal with treaties such as those of Jays and Pinckney's. And Washington's administration will also set the course for American foreign policy for the next century and almost century and a quarter to come, up until at least until the involvement of Americans in World War I will occur. Okay? But Washington has to deal with something else. Because of the differences in opinion between Hamilton and Jefferson, first over the issue of a national bank. Now, one of the things about the national bank was simply this, right? Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, wants to put the national economy on a good footing. In order to do that, Hamilton wants to increase American homemade or manufactured goods. He wants to levy protective tariffs so that those industries can begin the process of growth, as what is happening in England or Great Britain at this time. Hamilton wants to levy a series of taxes on the American people to fund the operations of the federal government. And we will see that through the first excise taxes. In other words, what will, of course, bring on what we will call the Whiskey Rebellion, which is the first test of Washington's presidential leadership as commander-in-chief. And Hamilton will also charter the creation of a national bank. Why a national bank? Well, the national bank was supposed to provide a sound currency for the new nation. It was supposed to provide credit for people to open up businesses, to expand their farms. And it was also supposed to do something else. It was supposed to provide stability for the finances of the U.S. government and provide a sense of a way for paying off the federal debts accrued from the states, which were assumed by the federal government from the Revolutionary War. The issue of assumption, assuming the Revolutionary War debts of the states, was not exactly a popular issue. In fact, it's one of Hamilton's first crises that he has to deal with Thomas Jefferson. But we're going to get to that in a moment. Creating the national bank was also a major issue in itself. First of all, when we think about the Bank of the United States, it's not so much about what the bank does. It's about, does the federal government have the ability to create such an agency? You know, we've been all throughout American history up to this point. What's so interesting is this. We've talked about the creation of agencies in the federal government. during Reconstruction, such as the Freedmen's Bureau, during the administration of the progressive presidents, such as Theodore Roosevelt, for example, with the Food and Drug Administration. We see a myriad number of agencies created during the presidency of FDR as a part of the New Deal programs. And we see a set of agencies created also to administer the programs of the Great Society in the 1960s. But where did the ability to do this actually come from? It actually came from the first battle over the national bank. That battle was a constitutional one. Hamilton said in Article 1, Section 8, taking what we call the elastic clause, that Congress has the ability to create any agency that it deems to be necessary and proper to its functioning. Hamilton's stretching this to say that that also means that Congress can charter or create a national bank. Jefferson says there's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about creating a national bank or such an agency. So therefore, because it doesn't say so in the Constitution, Congress doesn't have the power to create it. Hamilton wins the argument. Both men had written letters about the issue of the national bank because it was such a divisive issue to President Washington. Ultimately, it's Hamilton's point of view that wins over Washington. And the first agency of the federal government, the Bank of the United States, is created in 1791. Hamilton and Jefferson are not over with their arguments, right? In foreign policy, the issues became much more heated. Hamilton favored the British system. He favored trade with Great Britain to help the growth of the young United States and its economy. Jefferson wanted America to side with its old ally, France. The division between the two of them eventually led to the creation of the first two political parties. We refer to them as Democratic Republicans, or sometimes just as Republicans, but for the most part we call them Jeffersonian Republicans. Hamilton's party took the name of Federalist because they were in favor of a strong central government. And therefore, they placed themselves right at the root of being the people who were in favor of the Constitution and a strong federal government from the beginning. We're going to get into Jeffersonian democracy and what I think of as the birth of conservatism in American politics in a little bit. But let's talk more about the Washington years and the precedents that are set for just a second, right? The issue of assumption becomes the next major divisive issue that Washington has to deal with in 1792. Again, assuming the state debts coming out of the Revolutionary War was quite controversial. Why? Because states where the Revolution was fought tended to have more debt than states where it had not been fought at all. Or states that had not, for example, sent as many troops, equipped as many troops, who had been a part of the Continental Army. So therefore, some states had large debts coming out of the American Revolution, and some states barely had any at all. Some states had paid off their debts by the early 1790s. Others acquired huge debts, and their debts skyrocketed during the 1780s. Now the federal government, whether it was deemed to be fair or not, had to assume all of those debts, right? At least that's what Hamilton's proposing. Madison and Jefferson, both Virginians, are against this idea. Why? Virginia had already paid off its debts. And that's because much of the fighting in the American Revolution actually doesn't occur in Virginia until the Battle of Yorktown at the very end of the war, right? But a compromise is brokered between Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson over the issue of the assumption of the state debts from the Revolutionary War. Now that debt becomes, for the first time in our history, a national debt. And the compromise brokered means that southern states now get the national capital. Land is taken from the states of Maryland and Virginia, renamed the District of Columbia, and then Washington Town, soon to be Washington, D.C., now becomes the national capital. Now, the White House and the seat of government are not moved there until 1800. So John Adams is the first president to actually be in the White House for a short period of time, but Jefferson's the first president to actually spend the majority all of his first two terms, his two terms in office in Washington, D.C. as the nation's capital, okay? Washington has to deal with another crisis, sort of Hamilton's making in many respects, but what Washington does in dealing with this crisis sets a precedent for future presidents to follow in a couple of different ways, and that's with the Whiskey Rebellion. Remember that Hamilton wanted to lay a series of excise taxes. What are excise taxes? Taxes on luxury goods, items that people do not necessarily need or have to have, right? One of those taxes that Hamilton levies in 1791 that he wants to generate revenue for the new federal government from is a tax on whiskey. The only problem with that is simply this. Farmers in places like western Pennsylvania and in the backcountry of the United States, in its rural areas, right? Farmers who grew grain for the idea of not just for making bread and not just for using it as livestock feed, but also for making whiskey, because whiskey was a major money maker for them. Now all of a sudden they view this tax as being unfairly targeting them. And in the summer of 1794, some of those farmers refused to pay that tax. And ultimately they start a rebellion, and they have a familiar battle cry. It says, "No taxation without representation." That was because if we looked at the House of Representatives, even at that time, but even more so today, right? People who lived in America's growing port cities at the time tended to have more representatives and representation. People who lived in America's backcountry, backwards, or rural areas, even at this time, had less representation. And so therefore, they felt like they had a beef with the Washington administration over the application of the whiskey tax. Washington himself puts down the Whiskey Rebellion. Hamilton, who incites this process, went with Washington, which angered the people of western Pennsylvania, the farmers there, even further. The fact that federal troops in 1794 had to be used to put this rebellion down was not lost on Jefferson and his political followers. In fact, what we see that happens is political division coming out of the Whiskey Rebellion. So for the very first time, we see two political parties emerge that begin to have distinctive regional characteristics that match the politics in today's America. Backcountry farmers and people that lived in rural areas and small towns tended to favor the Jeffersonians. Why? They favored lower taxes and more power to the state governments and a smaller federal, less active federal government. In other words, this is the beginning of what we think of as Jeffersonian democracy to an extent coming out of the Whiskey Rebellion. Federalists tend to live in America's growing port cities during this period and its large towns. And so what we see is a rural-urban divide that begins in American politics even during the 1790s. They tend to be more educated, the Hamiltonians. They tend to be more urbane or cultured. They tend to be, for us, wealthier in many respects. And they tend to be not exactly a majority of the population, but a split in that population. What's interesting is this. They tend to favor, of course, the Bank of the United States. They tend to favor strong financial institutions. They tend to favor trade with Great Britain. And they tend to favor something else, a strong and active federal government, okay? Washington himself is also a Federalist, okay? Back to that Whiskey Rebellion. But the fact that the federal government and an army of federal troops at its head, George Washington, was used to put down this Whiskey Rebellion, was seen as being a bridge too far for Jefferson and his supporters. They thought, this was a protest, but violence should not have been used to put it down in such a measure, right? Or the threat of it, right? The other thing is this. Washington uses the first presidential pardons in American political history to pardon people who were a part of the leadership of the Whiskey Rebellion, right? So it's the first time that federal troops are used and the power of the presidency is used to enforce the law here in the United States. It's the first time that a president uses presidential pardons for people who have broken the law, right? It's the first time that we see two political parties divided regionally over a major political issue. And it's the first time that we see, for example, an issue of taxation become an issue where we have a different philosophy about the American government actually coming into play with the formation of the first two political parties, okay? But that's not the end of the issues for Washington's administration. He also has to deal with foreign affairs. When Washington took office, the British still had forts on the western frontier. The United States still bordered the Spanish Empire in the west. The United States also is dependent upon, with its western border, as western growth was occurring, it's still dependent upon the Mississippi River as a conduit for taking goods and services to ports like New Orleans. So getting the port of New Orleans open for American business is going to be important for Western farmers. Here's the issue, right? So with Pinckney's treaty, we're able to access the Mississippi River, right? And we're able to, in that respect, use the port of New Orleans to bring American goods through the Gulf of Mexico into ports around the world and in the Caribbean, right? Jay's treaty is highly unpopular. Jay's treaty was designed to remove the British presence from the American West. Now, why does the presence of British forts incite Americans, right? Why does it anger Americans during this period? There is this fear that Native Americans that are living on the western frontier in the backcountry, right, are being incited by the British, okay, in Canada, on the western frontier. And the fear of that led Washington to send the Chief Justice of the United States of the Supreme Court, John Jay, to negotiate this treaty. Jay doesn't get the removal of those British forts. And whenever Jay's treaty is ratified by the U.S. Senate in 1795, much like the Whiskey Rebellion, Democratic Republicans, the party of Jefferson, explodes because Jay's treaty gave trade concessions to the British on the one hand, right, which was against the interests of the Democratic Republicans. But on the other hand, Democratic Republicans tend to live in the backcountry. They tend to live on the frontier. And so, if we think about it for a moment, they saw Jay's treaty as being against their interests because it incited Native American attacks on their farms and small towns. Okay? By the time Washington leaves office in 1796, he's advocating in his farewell address that Americans end the partisan political bickering. In other words, that they bring an end to political partisanship, political parties. Washington's also preaching what brought this on in the first place, right? The disagreement over whether or not we should be involved and whose side we should be on in the French Revolution versus the question of having British support. Washington therefore says that the United States should remain out of European affairs, that we should become, in effect, isolationist in foreign policy. Now, what we have to think about for just a moment is this, right? Washington's term sets precedents, but his vice president, who gets elected in 1796 during the first election between two major political parties, the Jeffersonians on the one hand and the Federalists on the other, actually showcases a major flaw in the Constitution. You see, in 1796, because the Constitution didn't anticipate political parties, yes, there is an electoral college, but the way presidential campaigns were run were this, and the way the election results were tallied were as such. If I was the second place vote, if I received the second place number of votes. I became the vice president at the time. The top vote getter became the president of the United States. Now, we're going to see that become a problem in the election of 1800, but it became a problem in 1796. John Adams, who is running for the presidency as a Federalist, Washington's vice president, wins narrowly, 73 electoral votes to 65 for Jefferson. So now somebody from an opposite political party who has different ideologies about American politics now becomes a part of a presidential cabinet as the vice president. That would be unimaginable to us today. For example, in 2016, it would be unimaginable to us to have Donald Trump as the president and Hillary Clinton as the vice president. I cannot imagine what Americans would think of that today. And I can't imagine what our politics would look like either if that happened, right? But in 1796 and until the election of 1800, that's the way the American political system, as far as the election of the presidency, actually worked. Now, we have to understand something. When Adams becomes president, we also have another flare-up in tensions between the United States and France. You see, at the end of the French Revolution, the French go to war against the British. Washington's policy of neutrality still stands in the mind of John Adams, but not necessarily in the mind of Federalists who favor Hamilton's point of view in having stronger ties with the British. When American sailors are impressed by French naval vessels, a quasi-war between France and the United States breaks out from 1798 to 1800. This gives us one of the first dark chapters in American political history. You see, remember, the Jeffersonians had always wanted to have better ties with France. Immigrants tend to also be moving into the American backcountry during this period and become small farmers. Immigrants, therefore, tend to vote Jeffersonian. Seeing that more people are coming into the United States, voting Republican, and moving into the colonial backcountry, a Federalist Congress in 1798, fearful also of their ties to France, the enemy in this pseudo-war at the time, passes two of the most heinous acts in American history. You know them as the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, I don't have them up here, but I am going to put them up here with John Adams, the Alien and Sedition Acts, right? Notice we're spending a lot of time right here. Well, what the Alien and Sedition Acts essentially said were the following things. Number one, they changed the citizenship requirement. Immigrants could not become citizens, and therefore immigrant male heads of households could not become voters until they had been in the country for 14 years, right? Well, in 1798, 14 years would mean that they had to have been here by the time the Revolution came to an end in 1783, right? Before that, the requirement had only been 5 years. So in essence, what were they trying to do? Curtail a growing voting bloc of people who would vote for a political party that was ideologically against their interests, right? But that's not where they stopped. They also create what is called the Sedition Act. The Sedition Act said that you could not criticize the President of the United States, nor could you write critically about the President of the United States. Okay, this is targeted mostly at Republican newspapers in small towns across the states and in the backcountry. Now, we have to keep in mind something for just a moment, right? This was very divisive. So divisive that Madison and Jefferson both felt like they had to respond to it. And they write what are called the Virginia and Kentucky Resolutions. Madison writes the Virginia Resolutions in late 1798. And in essence, what Madison says is that the Alien and Sedition Acts violated the First Amendment right to a free press and freedom of speech. Jefferson in 1799 with the Kentucky Resolutions actually goes a step further. He actually advocates to the state legislature of the new western state of Kentucky, which was carved out of land from Virginia, that a state could, because states came into the Union as a compact and ratified the Constitution, that a state could in fact nullify a law or disobey a law of Congress. Now, this is very dangerous because what Jefferson is implying, right, will be the same thing that happens in 1828 with South Carolina and again in 1860 with South Carolina with the issue of secession, right? That you could do what? You could pick and choose which federal laws you wish to obey or not. So Jefferson is ideologically opening up the can of worms that eventually will lead to the same type of political thinking on the eve of the Civil War in the South. Okay? The Alien and Sedition Acts divided America so much so, and the desire to go to war divided the Federalist Party so much so, that Hamilton, who favored us going to war against France, actually splits with his own president, John Adams, who favors us taking a course of neutrality. We eventually end our relationship with France with the Treaty of Mortefontaine, which ends our alliance with France from the Treaty of Amity and Commerce that we had signed during the American Revolutionary War after the Battle of Saratoga, which gave us that French alliance. But it also strengthened Thomas Jefferson's voting bloc and support of Democratic Republicans who are up in arms over the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. So in 1800, when Adams tries to run for the presidency again, this time an anomaly in the constitutional system in 1800 actually occurs. Now, in theory, vice presidential candidates now, for the first time, run with a presidential candidate on a particular party ticket. So you have Jefferson and the Republicans, right? And Aaron Burr is his vice president running with him. You have John Adams and Charles C. Pinckney running as Federalists, right? Well, the Federalists lose. Jefferson garners 73 electoral votes, and Adams gets 65. Charles C. Pinckney gets 64 because the Federalist elector had thrown away their vote. The only problem is this. Aaron Burr gets 73 electoral votes too because one Republican elector forgot to throw away or did not throw away their ballot. So now the election of 1800 goes to the House of Representatives, which is still controlled by the Federalist Party. This is where Alexander Hamilton steps into politics for the very final time. You see, Hamilton and Aaron Burr were not good friends at all, to say the least. They hated one another. But Hamilton's hatred for Burr was more of a personal hatred than an ideological one. Hamilton didn't like Jefferson either. We've already talked about that. But they didn't like each other ideologically. He respects Thomas Jefferson. He just doesn't agree with him. It's finally Hamilton that sways enough members of the House of Representatives to provide the electoral capability for Jefferson to become the President of the United States in 1800. And for the first time in American history, a revolution in politics ends bloodlessly, right? In other words, we have what? A differing political party now assuming the reins of political power as Jefferson becomes inaugurated in 1801, after the election of 1800. And what Jefferson does is gives one of the great inaugural addresses in American history by saying, we are all Democrats, right? We are all Federalists. We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans, right? We are all Americans. And so Jefferson gives us this first time in American history, right? Although Washington was doing the same thing in his farewell address, of trying to bring a sense of national unity into American politics, right?